Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal, and today we're going to be covering the second part of the Ottoman history program. In the studio, I have my regular guests, Amjad Hussain. Assalamu alaikum, Amjad.
Wa alaikum
And
salam.
Arif Ahmad as well.
Assalamu alaikum.
In the last program, we looked at how the Ottoman Empire started with some of the great figures, starting from Osman the First, who basically gave the name to the Ottoman Empire. And we worked through to Mehmed the Second, a great Sultan, if there ever was one, and some of his achievements were covered there. In today's program, we're going to really look at the period after him, and rather than going through each Sultan or Ottoman ruler, we're going to focus on a few main ones and main achievements. So we're going to jump to Salim the First. Amjad, if you could take us through. He was the grandson of Mehmed the Second, or Mehmet, as some Turkish folks say.
Yeah, Mehmed the Conqueror, as he's known, is the grandson of Mehmed the Conqueror and son of Bayezid II. And he was the Ottoman Sultan, and his reign is notable for enormous expansion of the empire, particularly his conquest of the entire Sultanate of Egypt, or the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, between 1560 and 1570, which included all of the Levant, Hijaz, and Egypt itself. And through the consequences of this battle, he unified the various Muslim heartlands. And after having the Sharifs of Mecca grant him also the title of the custodian of the two holy mosques in 1517, Salim strengthened the Ottoman claim to the caliphate because the last Abbasi caliph who was stooge of the Mamluks, was residing in Cairo. So basically, he was summoned, or he was brought to Constantinople or Istanbul, and he was asked over to hand over the title of the Caliph of the Muslims. So basically, the Ottoman sultans were sultans before, now they became the caliphs of the Muslims. And by capturing the Hijaz, the two holy cities, they got the Sharif, who was the governor of the two cities, also granted the new Turkish sultan the title of the custodian of the two holy
This,
mosques.
of course, stayed until
1920s.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a major achievement.
So yes,
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
so that's basically their claim to the caliphs of the Muslims, and also solidify their claim to the caliphate because they were also now the custodians of the two holy places.
It's interesting. Salim the First clearly deviated from the previous Ottomans, who had focused mainly on the conquest in European lands. And Arif, apart from dealing with the Mamluks, of course, Salim the First was beginning to challenge the Iranian-Persian power with the Safavid Empire.
The Safavid. Well, first of all, like any great ruler, he was experienced in fighting. They said that he was skilled in politics, but he was also very fond of fighting. And also he wanted to consolidate his power. So there was a growing and a rising threat in Iran and in Persia. And the person who was his rival, his main rival, you could say, was Shah Ismail. So to set the scene, he had effectively conquered the whole of Iran and modern-day Azerbaijan. There was also a religious difference because he was an adherent to Shia Islam, whereas Salim was more of the Sunni Islam background. So he saw him as a great threat. And there was some correspondence and some initial diplomacy, but as usual in these sorts of situations, it ended up with fighting and rebellions. So what he did was he saw this as partly stopping Shiism spreading into the Ottoman Empire. And as I said, after the initial letters, there was various battles. I think the most famous one in 1514 is a battle of Chaldiran. His army, although Ismail's army were better prepared, the Ottomans, they had a more efficient army and they had better tactics, and so they were basically able to defeat Salim, and they entered the Iranian capital of Tabriz. And it was quite an acrimonious. I mean, Salim, after he had won this decisive victory, he referred to Ismail and saying that his adversary was always drunk, to the point of losing his mind and totally neglectful of the affairs of the state. So he wasn't very magnanimous in winning. He decided to criticize him. But again, that was part of his personality, and that, really ramming the point home and making sure that the defeated were properly defeated. So that was his first military, you could say, significant military campaign.
It's interesting, Amjad, isn't it? Because there's a famous verse of his in relation to two Sufis and two kings. Did you want to?
Yes.
It reminds me of that.
The Salim was also a very distinguished poet, and he wrote both in Turkish and Persian, and he will use his poetry to ridicule his rivals in the Safavid Empire, and as my colleague has just alluded to. Yes, of course, and this competition between the Safavids and the Ottomans continued, and Salim remarked in a poetic way that a carpet is large enough to accommodate two Sufis. However, the world is not large enough for two kings.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. But talking of two kings and a variety of kings, so you had obviously the Mamluks, you've got the Safavids, and then further there you had the Mughals as well. And I understand there was an interaction with Babur as well, with Salim the First.
Yeah, Babur's early relations with the Ottomans were initially troubled because Salim provided Babur's arch-rival Ubaidullah Khan with powerful musketeers and cannons to counter the influence of the Safavids. In 1507, however, he ordered to accept Salim as the Caliph of Muslims. But however, the Mughals remained, basically fiercely independent. In 1513, Salim reconciled with Babur, dispatched Ustad Ali Kulli, and the artilleryman, one of the famed artillerymen, Mustafa Rumi, and Machlok musketeers and many other Ottoman Turks to assist Babur in his conquest of India's subcontinent. And therefore, this particular assistance provided by the Ottomans basically cemented the future relationship between the Ottomans and the Turks.
I mean, there's so much more that could be said about Salim, and as with many other Ottoman rulers, but one of the things that he did was he laid the solid foundations for his son, whom we're going to talk about now, Suleiman the Magnificent. So obviously, when he passed away, then the rule went to Suleiman the Magnificent. That's the title given in the West most commonly. There's lots of other titles given to him. But do you want to tell us?
I think just one small point as well that we should make is that Salim obviously did also conquer the Sultanate of Egypt. That was another significant
I think we mentioned that in
the Mamluks.
Yes. But the important thing was when he became the ruler of the two cities, he did not take the title of Hakim ul-Haramain, or the ruler of the two holy cities. He accepted a more pious title rather, that the servant of the two holy cities, Khadim ul-Haramain Sharif.
No, he was a very thoughtful, deep thinking person. So moving on to Suleiman then. I mean, there's so much that we need to cover during his period, but he shook much of Europe and he consolidated his reign in the Muslim parts. Arif, his initial push was in Europe, and he was the first Ottoman ruler who actually managed to successfully take Belgrade, because his great-grandfather, Mohammed II, had tried but failed due to European, obviously,
politics.
Armies.
Just to set the scene, I mean, Suleiman the First, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent, he was the 10th and the longest reigning Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And again, during his administration, the Ottoman state ruled between 20 to 30 million people, which is, by any standard, quite a significant group of people. He really was more looking towards Europe, looking at the economic and military power of the Ottoman. He really wanted to lead that. And it was Christian strongholds of Belgrade and Rhodes, which I think is in modern-day Greece, as well as most of Hungary, that he first turned his attention towards. And in 1529, I think his conquests were actually checked there. He didn't actually succeed in this Siege of Vienna, but conquered a large part of the area around, and also much of the Middle East and large parts of North Africa, Algeria. So you can see that
Hungary also fell, I think.
Hungary as well. Sorry, Hungary
Yeah,
fell, and also the fleets were actually quite dominant in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. So you can see how great the expansion was happening. Obviously, it's difficult sometimes when you're trying to overstretch yourself to conquer all of these places, but no doubt there was big progress that were made in that time.
I mean, the fleet also stretched to the Indian Ocean as well. So at that stage, they were probably one of the greatest ruling empires with that sort of availability. Amjad also he consolidated further, didn't he, his control over the Muslim lands through in his Safavid empire, and also North Africa as well. He went up to Algeria, which became quite an important part of the.
Well, having consolidated his frontier with the European nations, and he turned his attention basically to the threat that was posed by the Shia Safavid dynasty of Persia. The two events in particular were to participate in recurrence of the tensions. First, with the Shah Tamash had Baghdad governor loyal to the Suleiman killed and replaced with an adherent of the Shah. And second, the governor of Baltis had defeated and sworn allegiance to the Safavids. So as a result, in 1533, Suleiman ordered his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, to lead an army into Eastern Asia Minor, where he took Baltis and also occupied Tabriz without resistance. And having joined Ibrahim in 1534, Suleiman made a push towards Persia, only to find the Shah sacrificing territory instead of facing a pitched battle, resorting to the harassment of the Ottoman army as it proceeded along the harsh interior. And of course, Suleiman accused the Shah of a scorched earth policy, and the Shah actually did resort to scorched earth policy to check the advance of the Ottomans. And it was really a shame that the two Muslim dynasties, who had rival claims in their own rights to the caliphate in a way, and not just territorial claims, of course. And like his son had already said, it's okay for Sufis to, Sufis can share a carpet. For two kings to share the world, it's just really impossible. So you were basically locked in perpetual warfare for territory, for dominance, for legitimacy, and so on.
I mean, the other thing about Suleiman the Magnificent was his sort of involvement in the Indian Ocean and Arif. Do you want to cover some of that?
Yeah, I think Ottoman ships, they'd been sailing in the Indian Ocean since the early 1500s, I think 1518. And they had tried to, increase their significance, their influence, and they had also contact with the Mughal Empire. I think Iqbal and Suleiman the Magnificent, they exchanged documents. But I think it was the naval campaigns against the Portuguese. I think this was very important for trading routes.
Because this was the stage where Europe was beginning to expand, wasn't it, really?
Absolutely.
On this side of Europe and going towards the Far East, etc.
And the Portuguese and Europe was trading with modern-day India and Pakistan. And I think the Ottomans saw that this was an opportunity for them. So they did try. I think there was a siege of Diu in 1538, but they failed against the Portuguese there. They returned to Aden, and they did, I think, manage to take control of Yemen. But again, there was rebellion and a lot of skirmishes and lots of fighting. So it took some time for Suleiman to eventually, consolidate his power. And there was a lot of fighting, a lot of struggling. There was also diplomacy that was involved. But I think he was very, very keen on establishing this route because it was very critical to the empire, the economic power of the empire, to have these trading routes.
It's interesting. A lot of people look at the expansion during Suleiman the Magnificent's time, and it probably was the golden age for the Ottoman Empire, both in terms of land mass and expansion, but also in terms of the sort of architecture, poetry, the learning. And it's interesting, in the West he is known as Suleiman the Magnificent, But in Turkey itself, he was known as Suleiman Kanuni, the lawgiver, because one of the great things that he did for his subjects was to have this interplay between Sharia law, the basic Islamic law, and the law as sort of presented by Suleiman in a pluralistic society. Amjad, I mean, that was quite notable during his reign, wasn't it? Because he had many Christian subjects under him as well.
Oh, absolutely. As you said, he was also a great legislator, standing out in the eyes of his people as a high-minded sovereign and magnanimous figure, exponent of justice. As you know, in all Muslim lands, the overriding law of the empire always been as Sharia law, as the sacred law, and is basically divinely inspired. And the sultans didn't. But however, that was only applied to the Muslims. However, the Sultan also was a secular figurehead as well. So basically, outside of Sharia, he had powers to enact laws. And because the Ottoman Empire has always been a pluralistic empire that had many communities residing within the Christian, Jews, and various Christian denominations, basically the Orthodox, the Armenian Church, and also the Syriac Church, which is the Arab Christians, and also Catholics as well. So basically, he was minded towards the various subjects of his kingdom. And of course, many of these dependents came under common criminal law, and there was also land tenures and taxation laws as well. And basically, he collected all these judgments that had been issued by the ninth of his predecessors, and he eliminated duplications and contradictions from their statements, and he issued a single legal code for all the territories. And of course, the tenets of Islam were not binding on non-Muslim subjects. And it was within this framework, it was that he was much liked and loved by the people. And of course, he acquired a lot of wealth and a lot of empire, but Suleiman was also very gifted in poetry, and he would say that the people think of wealth and power as the greatest fate, but in this world a spell of health is the best state. What men call sovereignty is a worldly strife and constant war. However, worship of God is the highest throne, the happiest of all estates.
That was interesting. He was quite pious as well, and yet he had subjects from a whole variety, and including his concubines, wives, etc. Arif?
And absolutely, I was just going to say the small point is that he was trying to introduce a system of fairness. And I think what this actually encouraged is that some Christians and Jews actually would migrate to these Turkish territories because they felt that they would be treated more fairly there. Now, any emperor wants to bring in the best people, and one of the ways of bringing in people from other lands is to treat all of your subjects fairly, not give preference just to the Muslims. So there was some methodology in what he was trying to achieve. He was trying to attract the best people, trying to be fair. And obviously, everybody has a different interpretation of what was being fair, but there was some reasoning behind this, and generally, he did look after the rights of Muslims and non-Muslims.
In relation to, we were talking about the sort of the golden age, and apart from the legislation and the poetry and literature, etc., he was a great admirer of great architecture as well, and he very much supported the work of Mimar Sinan, one of the great architects of the time, who went on to develop the Suleimaniye Mosque. Amjad, even now when you go to Istanbul, Arif rather, it's one of those amazing skyline features, the mosque in terms of its origins. Just talk us through a little bit.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, Mimar Sinan was the main architect, but of course Suleiman was the driving force behind this. The rationale was that he wanted to turn Constantinople into the center of Islamic civilization, and one of the ways of doing this is by having these great buildings. So Ottoman architecture definitely reached its highest point during his reign. I think there was over 300 monuments that were built throughout the empire, and the Suleimaniye and the Salim Mosque They were the sort of the centerpieces. But I think also something which is often overlooked is that Suleiman also restored the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and even renovated the Kaaba in Mecca as well. So, he felt that this was part of his Islamic responsibilities to look after the Kaaba, restore the Dome of the Rock. I think even in Damascus there were buildings as well. So it wasn't just in Turkey; it was throughout the Islamic world, or the area that he controlled, where he was building these monuments. All emperors like to build monuments to reflect what they're doing, and maybe build monuments to reflect their own image. But there was, again, functionality in what they were building. Mosques are obviously places where people contribute, congregate, and where they obviously are thankful for having a place to worship.
I mean, Sinan also was used by the Ottoman emperors to develop the Topkapi Palace, which again is a prominent feature in Turkey currently. Its origins go back, I think, earlier, Amjad, the 1400, and I can't remember the exact date, but it was during Sinan's period that it was really made as a grand palace where the sultans, Ottoman rulers, could entertain various dignitaries.
Oh, absolutely. The foundations of the famous Topkapi Palace were laid none other than by his grandfather, Mohammed the Conqueror, great-grandfather rather, Mohammed the Conqueror, in the 15th century. And successively Topkapi Palace had been built, but there was a fire during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, starting from the kitchens, and much of the palace kind of burned down. And it was a great opportunity out of the ashes to rebuild and revamp the whole palace, and it became actually a great piece of theatre and also to entertain various foreign dignitaries, to receive ambassadors, to hold state banquets and so on. So it basically solidified among the kings of Europe that the Ottoman sultans were held in high esteem by their splendor, grandeur, and their good taste in architecture and culture and civilization. And just in passing, the two great admirals of that time, which have become legendary. One is Hadruddin Barbarossa, is well known, and there are many films, and the other is Pri Rais of the famed Pri Rais map, which is still a mysterious map, that because it also Antarctica has been charted without the ice sheet. Right. It's one of the most mysterious maps of the world. How can we have Antarctica, the continent of Antarctica, and its coastline basically is buried under several miles of ice that extends miles and miles out into the ocean, so nobody can see the coastline of that, and also the coastline of the entire Americas, the southern Americas, and been well charted. So the two esteemed admirals, they basically held sway over most of the seas of the world as well, and they become legendary.
And just one small point about Topkapi Palace. It's basically a museum these days, and it's actually a World Heritage Site. So that shows you the significance of the architecture as well as the historical significance of that site, how in such high esteem that place is held.
No, absolutely. It's breathtaking. I took my children, I think, about 8 years ago or so. So it is. Obviously, Suleiman the Magnificent had achieved a lot. But one of the downsides for him was his failure to take Vienna, and he was responsible for the first main siege of Vienna from the Ottomans, which failed. Just talk us through a little bit, and then probably we'll be just in time for a break and we'll carry on.
Yeah, I think it was around 1529. Again, Suleiman always was trying to capture Vienna, a great city even in modern times. And I think he had a garrison of around 16,000 men. So there was obviously a lot of determination here. But the Austrians did inflict their defeat. And this rivalry that created it continued more or less till the 20th century. So this Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry sprung from this first siege. I think there was a second attempt in 1532. And again, there was a siege at Gunz. And again, they didn't reach Vienna. Now, again, whenever there's a battle, sometimes there's bad luck. In this situation, there was bad weather. and that meant that they had to leave behind a lot of their equipment, and it meant that the supply lines were overstretched. So even though they were prepared, you can't legislate for things like the weather, and that meant that these two sieges failed. I think, again, in the 1540s, there was another renewal of the conflict. And, you know, a lot of going back and forward. And I think it was King Ferdinand and Charles. Eventually, in 1544, they signed a treaty, which was in favour of Suleiman. So Ferdinand renounced his claim to the Kingdom of Hungary, and he had to pay a tax or a fixed yearly sum. And Charles V was no longer known as the emperor, but he was known as the King of Spain, and Suleiman was identified as a Caesar. So this was really, took a long time. It was not until 1544 that he really subdued his rivals in that area.
So whilst they failed to take Vienna, most of Hungary
was
captured, under the Ottoman rule, and that was really a major consolidation and expansion for the Ottomans. This is probably a good time to go for a break, and then we're going to look at the next phase of really the relative stagnation and some of the reforms the Ottomans tried to introduce. But all empires, they have 600 years plus was a long time for the Ottoman Empire, but we need to start tracing when the stagnation and decline started, and we'll cover that in the second part of the program. Welcome back. We were talking about Suleiman the Magnificent just before we finished, and just to finish off his period, he was clearly a great ruler who expanded the Ottoman Empire and provided much in terms of legislation and art and culture, etc. But he was also a very thoughtful man in terms of his religious and spiritual insights and interests. And Amjad, if you could take us through, he also got the tomb of Hazrat Ibn Arabi, one of the great Sufi mystics of Islam, built, didn't he?
Oh yes, when Suleiman the Magnificent, when he, following the successful conquest in the Middle East from his rivals, the Safavid Empire, when he got Damascus, he basically rebuilt the tomb of Ibn al-Arabi, the famed Muslim Sufi. And not just that, when Suleiman made grand entrance into Baghdad following his victory over the Shah of the Persia in 1535, he greatly enhanced his prestige by restoring the tomb of Hazrat Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school of Islamic law, to which the Ottomans themselves adhered to. And that basically, in the eyes of the clerics, in the eyes of the Muslims, populace, that really enhanced his prestige and his bond with the Muslim populace.
He was indeed magnificent, but all rulers, their rule comes to an end. And in terms of succession planning, he had a number of sons. But ultimately it was Salim who went on to become the next ruler. Do you want to take us through that succession planning, Amjad?
Well, Salim had been a very unlikely candidate, Dr. Iqbal, for the throne until his brother Mohammed died unexpectedly from smallpox. And previously his half-brother Mustafa had been strangled to death by the order of his own father. And his brother Bayezid was killed in the coordinated effort between himself and his father. This was basically to smooth the transition, as it were. It was a common practice within the Ottoman imperial household to eliminate the rivalry. But like I said, Salim was unlikely contender because of his half brother died, and he was actually meant to be. Mustafa was meant to be the. Mehmed was meant to be the heir apparent.
I mean, it was a difficult act to follow, wasn't it? Whoever was going to take over.
Absolutely. But I think one thing about Salim, though, is that he didn't really take a lot of interest in military matters. He was more interested in enjoying himself, let's put it that way. And one of his nicknames was actually Salim the Sot, which means Salim the Drunkard. So what he did was he left the power to the ministers, and he basically enjoyed himself. And actually, whether this is true or whether this is legend, the circumstances behind his death is that he died in the Great Palace, Topkapi Palace, but he basically had a fever, and when he was drunk, he slipped on the floor and banged his head. So, that shows that basically...
I think his grandfather will have been rolling in his grave having said whatever to his
having said that, I mean, he was actually quite a popular sultan. He had a very soft character, he was very sensitive, and he was also generous. And he did build a tomb to his elder brother, who was executed. So there was some good points. But I think in terms of the military campaigns, it looks like his heart really wasn't in it. And this was part of the start of the decline. We'll come on to talk about this in a bit more detail.
In many respects, Salim II marked the sort of stagnation period within the Ottoman Empire. And I said we're not going to go through every Sultan or Ottoman ruler, but the next major figure, I suppose, was Murad III. To tell us a little bit about him, because he had some interesting relationship with Britain in particular.
Well, indeed. During his reign, numerous envoys and letters were exchanged between Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, and Sultan Murad III. In one correspondence, for instance, Murad entertained the notion that Islam and Protestant faith had much more in common than they did with the Roman Catholicism. As both rejected the worship of idols, and he argued for an alliance between England and the Ottoman Empire. To the dismay of Catholic Europe, England exported both tin and lead for cannon casting and munitions to the Ottoman Empire, and Elizabeth seriously discussed joint military operations with Murad II during the outbreak of the Spanish War in 1585, and one of her admirals or one of our statesmen or politician, Francis Walsingham, was lobbying for a direct military involvement against the common Spanish enemy. This diplomacy actually continued under Murad's successor, Mohammed III, by both the Sultan himself and his mother, the Queen, the king's mother. She was known as Salafia Sultana, who was the wife and the consort of Murad III.
It's interesting. Well, very recently there was quite a major article in the New York Times, I think it was, in relation to this relationship between Elizabeth I and how the Ottomans stood by her when the rest of Europe was planning to basically invade and depose the rightful ruler of England. So it's interesting how history goes around.
Swings and roundabouts.
Absolutely. But Arif, moving further on then, another major ruler was Mohammed IV. Tell us a little bit about him and what the Ottoman Empire was facing around that time.
Yeah, he ruled between 1648 and 1687. He was only 7 when he came to the throne. And I think he was the second longest running sultan in Ottoman history. Again, part of the decline, there was a lot of military defeat, political instability. There was some revival in the middle years of his reign. But I suppose what his contemporaries thought of him was they thought of him more as a pious person, a ghazi or a holy warrior. And actually, although we talked about decline, it was during his reign that the height of the territorial expansion took place in Europe. He was known as a hunter, but eventually he was overthrown. And it was, again, another significant incident, which we'll come on to talk about, the War of the Holy League. This was ongoing, and this is really what led to his downfall, and again, part of the decline of the empire.
This is when clearly much of Europe started coming together to face off the Ottomans, and Arif mentioned the Holy League. Amjad, do you want to tell us a little bit? That included the Germans, the Polish, and obviously the Habsburgs, Austro-Hungarian rulers.
Well, basically in the 1680s, a new Holy League was initiated by Paul Innocent the 11th, and that encompassed the Holy Roman Empire, which was headed by the Habsburg Austrian Empire, the Venetian Republic, and Poland. Poland was joined in 1684, and so was Muscovite Russia in 1686. And Ottomans suffered 2 heavy defeats against the Holy Roman Empire. First in the battle in 1686 1687, and the second a decade later in 1697 at the Battle of Zenta. Basically, the Holy League, I said, basically was a host of European powers. I mentioned the Holy Roman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Tsardism of Russia, the Republic of Venice, the Kingdom of Hungary, Kingdom of Croatia, the Spanish Empire, the Electorate of Bavaria, the Serb rebel, and not just to mention these independent kingdoms. Rebellions within the Ottomans were actively encouraged by the Pope, using basically religion as a weapon. So the Serbs rebelled, the Albanian Christians, the Greeks rebelled, the Bulgarians rebelled, and so did some of the populations in Montenegro. And this was against the Ottoman Empire and its allies, the Crimea Khanate, and some of the upper Principality of Hungary, Moldova, Valencia, and so on. So basically, against this swayed the tide and combined alliance, Turkey suffered heavy defeat, and this basically led to loss of territory, self-confidence, and so on.
This was preceded, wasn't it, with the treaty? It's a famous treaty, the Treaty of Karlowitz, 26 January 1699, which basically marked.
Yeah, I think it was again part of the decline. The couple of points that were important there, as Amjad mentioned, there was loss of territory. So really, most of Hungary returned to the Habsburgs. I mean, there was 30,000 Ottomans that were killed allegedly, and a lot of others were dispersed. So it was an absolutely crippling defeat. And also what it caused is the Ottomans realised that they were not all powerful. So they adopted more of a defensive military strategy, defending what they had rather than trying to conquer new lands. And also what it did was it led to a lot of administrative reforms. Fighting wars is very, very expensive. You need to have a lot of money. Anybody knows that. So in a way they regrouped, they became more defensive, and they transformed themselves rather from a military empire into more of a bureaucratic one. So there was some thought about, consolidating what they had, but they realized that they were not all powerful and that they had to defend themselves against the enemies. And there were numerous enemies around at that time. And as we'll come on to talk about, many more lurking in the wings as well.
You mentioned earlier on also the Russians came on board, although they came on board later on much more sort of visibly and forcefully against the Ottomans. And that, in a sense, was a problem for the Ottomans because they'd had these continuous wars with the Habsburgs and the other European powers. Now another major power which had come into the fray, and the Ottoman were declining slowly and steadily. And that takes me to the Crimean War as well. I mean, prior to that, I think probably the biggest loss that the Ottomans faced against the Russians was in 1774. That was catastrophic with Russia. Over time they were losing. But then the Europeans started eyeing all the lands in Europe with each other, didn't they? As the Ottomans clearly were under pressure now from two ends. You had the Crimean War, which everybody talks about in its... do you want to talk us through a little bit?
Yeah, sure. There were, not just these defeats in Central Europe, but there were also a series of political and economic crises as well, resulting from inflation, like you mentioned, warfare, political factionalism. Yet despite all these crises, the empire kind of remained internally, the heartlands remained both politically and economically. When you are under siege kind of thing and on all fronts, you tend to consolidate. So the core really got together, the core of the Ottoman, the heartlands of Anatolia, as it were, around Adrian and around Constantinople, Istanbul, around Izmir, which were really all, Ottoman stronghold, as it were. But obviously...
But just in relation to my question on the Crimean, though, because that's an interesting place and also what happened there, and I just want to touch on it.
I think a lot of people will have heard of the Crimean War. I suppose it's one of the first modern wars, but the background to this is that Britain and France were looking at extending their influence, over the territories of the Ottoman Empire. And what they decided to do, rightly or wrongly, was to effectively help the Ottomans against the Russians. So the war was fought between 1853 and 1856. The name of the war, Crimean War, comes from the Russian Crimean Peninsula, which was the area around the Black Sea.
I mean, interesting, at that time there were Tartars,
Absolutely,
Muslim origin there. So I just want listeners to...
So what happened was eventually the Britain and France helped the Ottomans defend and fight off the Russians. One aspect which was quite important was the Ottoman Empire took out some loans to finance that one. That came back to bite them on the bottom later on, because obviously debt leads to problems later on. But on the point of the Tartars, again, people will have heard of Tartars. They are predominantly Muslim population. A lot of them, in effect, were exiled from their homelands, and they settled in the Ottoman Empire. And their influence was quite significant, because I think by the time the Ottoman Empire came to an end, a lot of the urban population of Turkey had descended from these Muslim refugees. So you see how this sort of mass migration that's associated with wars can influence the country, and this was no different. So the large numbers of refugees, they actually came into Turkey, and in some ways they helped to modernize Turkey, particularly the education. So there was a big legacy in terms of the debt and in terms of the immigration that came out of the Crimean War.
So an interesting situation. So you had the Russians really in ascendancy because of the technological advancements they'd made under Peter the Great. You had Britain expanding rapidly now, and also the French were on an expansion. And it just goes to show in 1863, it was basically the British and French that guaranteed the independence of Serbia, because basically the Ottomans were told more or less to retreat from Serbia. And so all these areas were now being lost to. And do you think it's worth just sort of looking at the different time scale, what happened, how they lost? But clearly, because we covered up to Hungary, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, all these areas were now
we're looking at
being lost.
Mahmud II, basically in 1804, the Serb revolution against the Ottoman rule erupted in the Balkans, running in parallel with the Napoleonic invasion. And by 1817, when the revolution ended, Serbia was raised to the status of self-government monarchy under nominal Ottoman control. And in 1821, the first Hellenic Republic became the first Balkan country to achieve its independence from the Ottoman Empire. It was officially recognized by the Ottomans in 1829. Basically, in the middle of the 19th century, the Ottomans faced multitudes of challenges and problems. Firstly, there was the Eastern question, or the Middle Eastern question, with the rival European powers, particularly Russia, England and France. And there were also internal military problems arising from the ambitious, mutinous Janissaries and factitious ulamas. And Turkey also faced conflict with Egypt, particularly the Wahhabis in the Arabian Peninsula, the Serbs and Albanians in the Balkans, and the Greek and the Syrians. And in 1804, the Serb revolution against the Ottoman rule erupted in the Balkans, running in parallel with the Napoleonic invasion. By 1817, when the revolution ended, Serbia was raised to the status of self-governing monarchy under the nominal Ottoman control. And then, of course, in 1821, the first Hellenic Republic became the first Balkan country to achieve independence from the Ottoman Empire. And in 1814, this secret organization that was founded is called Ereta, was founded with the aim of liberating Greece, and they were successful. And then there was also the Russian 1829, there was a Russian-Turkish conflict. And Turkey did not have enough time, having disbanded the Janissar Corps previously, and the Sultan was forced to use young, undisciplined recruits to fight the Tsarist Russia. Egypt took this opportunity and also became independent. There were subversions in the Middle East. There were also subversions against the Ottoman rule in the Balkans. And the Ottoman Sultan had asked Egypt for help. The Wali of Egypt, or the governor of Egypt, was semi-autonomous already, and he was a kind of a vassal. And the Sultan asked for his help, Muhammad Ali. But Muhammad Ali was not paid sufficient amount of money, so he did not join in to suppress the rebellions in the Balkans. And subsequently, taking the advantage of weakness of Turkey, he gained a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula and managed to wrestle some of the ground from the Ottomans. And also around that time, around the turn of the 20th century and conclusion of the 19th century, the empire was in dire situation economically. Certain social classes had long been oppressed and burdened through burdensome taxes. And with crippling economy, population in uprising, conflicts in provinces, Ottoman Empire was ripe for takeover.
I mean, clearly, the Ottomans had been losing ground to an expanding Europe and Russia all the time, and now you've got internal strife and problems. And the time was right for some sort of revolution, Arif, wasn't it?
Yes, I think a lot of our listeners will have heard of the term Young Turks, but this is where it originally originated in Turkey. There was a group of people, not just students, but also civil servants, also teachers. And what they decided was that, Turkey had been an empire for too long, and that really there should be some sort of constitutional reform. And that was what they wanted. So they were around the early 20th century. Some of them were also army officers as well. And they tried to lead a rebellion. Unfortunately, they weren't very united.
This was what, 1908?
1908, that's
yeah,
right.
Yeah,
the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. They did have some limited success. I think there was a second constitutional era established in 1908, and that led to multi-party democracy for the first time in the country's history. But as I said, eventually there was splintering and disunity. So although they did achieve some things, they didn't actually obviously get their full aim at that particular time. But what this did was it did also, I think, galvanize some of the opponents of the empire. So, for example, there was an Italian war in 1911, which in military terms was not a very significant war. I mean, it started at the end of September 2011, and Italy basically wanted back some territories. 1911, sorry. Yeah. Tripoli and Cyrenaica. Now, because the empire was so disunited and not military strong, within a month, Italy was successful, and they basically took that part. So this was an important precursor to World War I, because it sparked nationalism in the Balkan states. As Amjad had mentioned, a lot of the Balkan states had already been uprising and trying to gain independence. So they could see that the Ottomans were weak. The Italians also mixed things up by sending weapons to Montenegro. They were encouraging dissidents in Albania and in other countries as well. And this meant that the Balkan League eventually attacked the empire because they could see how weak it was. And it did result in a treaty of some sort, the first Treaty of Lausanne in October 1912, sorry. But again, it was part of the continuing decline. So there was internal strife with revolutionaries inside the country, and external strife with all the countries realizing that Turkey was not the power it was in the past.
I mean, in many respects, the wise words of Salim the First are coming true, wasn't it? Two Sufis could share a prayer mat, but two kings, and here were Germany, England, Britain, Great Britain, and Russia as well, at loggerheads really, and that led to what we called World War I. There had been wars and wars before, but this was the first major world war. And but just tell me, what shape was Turkey in at the moment? Who was sort of ruling at that stage when we faced First World War? What decision did they make in the First World War? Who to side with?
It was Sultan Murad III who was the ruler of Turkey at that time, and as Dr. Iqbal, our listeners will know, is that the Archduke of Austria-Hungarian Empire, Ferdinand II, was assassinated by Serb separatists
in Sarajevo.
That's right. And that became precursor to World War I, as it were. But obviously, there's much more than that. The Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time now became allied with the Ottomans, and they there was a European consort system where there was laws of alliances and counter-alliances against each bloc. And Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany being the predominant major player, was allied to the Ottomans. Because Germany had been latecomer to the imperial game, as it were, carving up the world. So Germany said to rest of the European powers is that where is my fair share of the resources of the world? So basically, Austro-Hungarian knew that Ottoman were in decline, and they proposed to the Sultan Amir II was that why don't we have basically a railway line? There was a transcontinental railway line from shores of Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean in America. So why can't there be a great railway line from Berlin to Baghdad? And that would have consolidated down the Danube, basically, into the Ottoman territory, into the Middle East. And basically, Germany would bring the goods from the Middle East to the European markets in a matter of days, if not weeks, whereas the rest of the European empires, they were maritime empires. And obviously, this would have resulted in these maritime empires like Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, even the Dutch, overnight obsolete, because now Turkey will consolidate its empire, Germany will become new power, a trading partner, and basically that was the economic reasons for World War One. And unfortunately, we knew what happened in World War One. Turkey was allied to Germany. There was defeat of Austro-Hungarian Empire. The subsequent German state got defeated, and so did the Ottoman dominions in the Middle East. They were carved up between the victors, between France and Britain. So basically,
it was interesting, wasn't it? During First World War, a number of the Arabs aligned themselves to the British.
The Sharif Hussain of Mecca,
well. Yes.
for instance, he was allied with the British. The British promised to become the new caliph of the Muslims, and then subsequently they didn't honor that agreement. However, one of the sons of Sultan Hamid, one of the sons of Sharif Hussain of Mecca was given Transjordan following occupation of the Middle East, and basically, the Middle East was carved up according to a treaty known as the Sykes-Picot Plan, and that is still actually why there's so much turmoil.
I think many listeners will know what intrigues went on around that period, and as Turkey lost the war, they were initially invaded by European troops as well. But Kemal Ataturk, a name well known to all Turks and many Muslims, came to the forefront in saving Turkey in many respects. But Arif, do you want to take us through a little bit?
Yes, I mean, obviously a very complicated character, but really in a way a savior of Turkey, a great military person. His major achievement was converting Turkey, abolishing the caliphate in effect, I think in 1922, and making Turkey a more modern, educated, secular state. His name itself, Ataturk, means father of the Turks, still had a very, very high esteem in Turkey. We could do a whole program about him. He's such an interesting person, but we're not really doing justice to him today. But really, he brought Turkey out of the decline and into the modern democracy.
But in many respects, I mean, those who have visited Turkey, and I've certainly visited Istanbul, and it's an absolutely fabulous place. And, Turkey is one of these modern states with a Muslim character, and we could go on and on, but I think our listeners have had a good glimpse into the Ottoman Empire, truly one of the great empires this world has seen. So I think let's bring this program to an end. Thank you, Amjad and Arif. Until our next program, Assalamu alaikum.